Good morning, YouTube. I swear, this is my last Omens video. At least until the next update comes out. I don't want to become just the Sonic channel. I already did that once. Don't want to do it again. I thought I might as well just do one final sort of send-off now that I've been playing Omens for an embarrassingly long amount of time. Just talking about my experience with it, hopefully explaining how I've been enjoying it so much for those of you who are still confused as to how anyone could like this game. This has been one of the most fun experiences of Sonic I've had in a while, so I'd like at least to sort of break down why that is, and hopefully you can at least go back and enjoy it a bit, or at least understand where the people who do like it are coming from. So I thought the best way to do that would be to run through every stage and just get an S rank on all of them. Hopefully no damage while I'm doing that, just so that you can get a general idea of why this game has hit home, and also see this game at its finest, or as close to finest as I can get it. We'll see how well that goes as we come along. So one thing to note is that I had a couple friends who aren't Sonic fans play this game, and they were woefully confused, lost, and didn't have the best of times. I think they agree with me that there's a lot of good points about this game, but the flaws were a little too much for them to cope. So, with that in mind, I'm not saying this game is for everyone, but I would say that it's worth giving a try. Maybe after seeing a lot of playthroughs of the stages, so that you know what is capable in the engines, that you can push yourself to match the skill level that you've seen people tackle it with. That's kind of why I wanted to do an S-rank playthrough. Really show what happens when you know these stages inside and out, and I've spent an embarrassingly long amount of time studying how to get through them all. One thing to note about S-ranks, they work very similar to how a lot of other Sonic games do. The actual point total for S-rank changes depending on the level, but there's some general standards that you can keep in mind. Time bonus is the probably biggest factor in determining how high your score gets, although I wouldn't say worrying about time is your biggest focus, since enemies in rings and also launching through rainbow rings and off dash pads can oftentimes raise your score much higher than that, and that's where the big points come from. So it's not necessarily a race to the end the same way that a lot of other Sonic games are, although you will notice that I am finishing these stages way faster than I did in my blind playthrough.
Tails?
For bosses in particular, though, time bonus is probably the most important thing. You don't want to miss any opportunity to attack these things, hopefully finish them off quickly, although it's a good idea to have a couple rings at the end as well. I wanted to prove to myself that I could do these damage lists, although I found that rings definitely help if you're not good at baiting out the most difficult attack patterns. The zombie Dragoon here, for example, has different attacks based on where you're standing in relation to it. So one of the things you want to do while fighting it is make sure that you're not accidentally encouraging it to do the wrong attack. This Gatling gun takes the longest amount of time. This tail whip is a little bit difficult to avoid, but the hardest to avoid is if you get right up next to it, it'll just slam down right in front of you. That is the fastest way to take out this boss and the way to get the max time bonus, but it's also a lot more difficult than I was willing to handle for a damageless run. As far as that goes, I do want to emphasize that a damageless run is consistently possible. This boss has no unpredictable attacks. It doesn't arbitrarily land on you like I've heard a lot of people claiming. It stays in those brightly lit up circles and generally cycles through the same attack pattern over and over again, depending on how many times you've hit it. As long as you're keeping an eye on its health bar, you should have a general idea of what to expect, and also how to bait the right attacks out of it at the right times. Keep some boosts so that you can keep your distance from it, and when the time comes for these last couple attacks where it aims straight for you, and generally you shouldn't have too much of a problem. I certainly thought it was fun to exercise figuring out the intricacies of that. Although, I'll leave that up for you to try and get the best time on that as well.
Wait, since when did G.U.N have a lab here?
Area 99 is my favorite level in this game, and easily the best demonstration of why I love doing these sort of S-rank, show-offy type runs. There's so many things to pull off, so many tricks, so many different ways you can explore certain obstacles. And it also gives me a good chance to explain how I'm handling this. So rather than going for speed, I will often detour for, say, a magnet shield to collect a lot of extra rings. While time bonus is important, the max time bonus you can get is 100,000 points. That starts to tick down at 100 points per second after a certain amount of time spent in the level. If you beat it any faster, you're not getting any better of a score, and most stages require more than 100,000 points to get your S rank. So one big focus in that case is to collect as many rings as possible, and that's why I have the magnet barrier here. As well as that, enemies are worth very, very large sums of points if you can take out a bunch of them. So I'd recommend aiming for them as much as possible, while also generally trying not to get hit, that's ideal, and grabbing as many rings as possible on the way. Since enemies in large clusters can be a risk though, you don't want to dally around, and as well as that, spending too long will take away some of your time bonus. So try your best to go for enemies and objects such as rings, dash rings, etc. that are in your way, and don't slow down to take out a whole swath of enemies unless you're rust thirsty like I am. Still though, really fun stage to run through. It's definitely my vote for the direction most of the other stages should take going forward.
Hey, Tails! Do you see my coordinates? The temple is here. Can you get to it?
And now for a sort of anti-recommendation. I'm not so big on these these plane stages. The Hyper Tornado itself is a fascinating control scheme, but it's also obviously something new and hard to get used to, and doesn't feel at first like it matches most of what Sonic should be focused on. I appreciate the playstyle shift. It's something that Adventure has always focused on, but, you know... It's alright. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. One thing that took me a while to learn is that it's a good idea to keep your distance from enemies. That way they can't attack you at all, and also you can get a better aim at them, both with your Gatling gun or rapid-fire Vulcan cannon, as well as your larger missiles. Keep an eye on your ammo count. That is very touchy. Especially since it takes so long to recharge, so sometimes keeping track of what ammo you do have available is the most important part of making your way through these stages. I will say it took me even longer than I'd like to admit to realize that boxes that also give you health refill your energy, which means that you're going to want to destroy those as often as you can, as well as collect as many rings as possible. Since you can't lose your rings in these stages, there's no real risk of collecting a lot of rings and then finding out that you wasted your time afterwards. So I like to make quick little detours. If I mentioned before, rings are worth 10 points when you collect them, and then an additional 100 points if you keep them to the end of the stage, which means every ring in this stage is a guaranteed 110 points if you don't die. That's more than a second worth of points, so it's definitely a good idea to keep an eye on your ring counts as you're going through. Try and collect as many as possible without slowing down too much for them. I think the system could use a little bit of balancing. Definitely one of the things that I would prefer seeing is that the red rings also give you points. It seems to be something that other Sonic games have done. I know Colors did that, where they gave a boatload of points for collecting red rings. But even just another 1,000 points per red ring would encourage you to shimmy out of your way just a bit in order to pick those up as well, thus making the stages more intricate and more demanding, and the red rings would have a purpose outside of just saying you collected them all, which I have done as well. Bragging rights, purely bragging rights, and so I'm here to brag. That said, I won't brag about my playing inside of this wind tunnel area. Not so fond of this. The wind doesn't affect you that much overall, and if you ever need to, you can slow down and actually see which way the wind is going, because the wind actually has visible trails, especially in this section, telling you which way it's blowing at any given time if you need a good breather on that. I, however, boost to win, and that's all I ever do, so I never stopped to check, and just dealt with it as I went through. Not the best performance on my part. As you can see, I've gotten hit several times, and no shame in that. I know I said I wouldn't be taking any hits, or at least to be a damageless run, but as is, taking damage doesn't actually affect anything in this stage, which is another thing I'd love to see, is both red rings and maybe your Hyper Tornado health bar contributing to score. Maybe a nice little tick down of how many health points you have left or something like that. Just some way to encourage players to not get hit going through. Of course, if I had to do damageless runs of these stages, you wouldn't be seeing this video right now. Escaping the Gnarl is probably the best example of that, and I'll get to what I mean when we hit the boss fight. If it bothers you to see me taking damage in these stages, I would say that should be your challenge, to sit down, crack down with this game, and make sure you get your own damageless playthrough. Upload it to YouTube and show off. In fact, show me up. Well, you're welcome to comment down below. I would love to see everyone caring enough about this game to go for damageless S-rank runs in the Hyper Tornado stages. I imagine this is a lot easier with keyboard and mouse, which is probably my own mistake for going controller, but I do like how the controller support handles in most stages, just not this one. Aiming is very hard. I'm not very good at FPSs, so... Also, there's no reason to go all the way around. I know the arrows tell you to, but you might as well just hang around here, spend that time allotted to the player to just collect a couple more rings. Rings are extremely important in this stage, since there are no enemies to get extra points from. You're going to want to amass around 250 rings before you get to the end of the stage. Make sure you hit every box that you can along the way. Even if you haven't taken damage, you will get points. Maybe a way to fix that would be that overhealing would get you extra points. I'm not really sure how that would handle, but it's my suggestions for how to improve this section a bit. Your Tornado has a much wider hitbox, though, than Sonic does, but also than it looks. So it's important to bear that in mind in both this and Wild Ridge, that you could very easily take a lot of damage quickly. However, that's kind of the best way to fight this boss, and this is what I mean about maybe the game could be more challenging if your health was accounted for in your score. The easiest way to fight this guy is just to wait for him to launch toward you and fire directly in his open mouth and let him plow right through you. It's the only time in the game where S-rank doesn't really feel like it reflects being a good hero like Sonic generally is encouraged to be. That said, this is kind of fun in its own right, trying to get him to aim for you, since he doesn't always. This boss is really interesting because it's so focused on sound cues. Maybe you didn't get the best chance to show it off, but I would recommend wearing headphones so you can hear exactly where the Gnarl is popping up from. But if you can beat it in under about 3.5 minutes and hold about 250 rings, getting an S rank shouldn't be that hard. Hopefully.
Tails, Can you find where the emerald signal is coming from?
Since Blue Jungle's level design is borrowed heavily from a previous Sonic game, I think it's a good chance to talk about what this game offers in place of those other games. Less automation, more free camera controls, and overall less restrictive death planes means you can do crazy stuff like this, and just skip whole swaths of level if you want to. Normally that's not the best idea when it comes to going for points, since there are points littered almost everywhere in these stages, but if you can find like somewhere you're only going to be skipping a couple rings maybe, or maybe a single enemy, it might be worth it. The camera controls are also something worth noting. I have to control that with the right stick, so that's the same thumb that's also hitting the A button to jump, so homing attack is a matter of switching back and forth between two forms of control stick use, or thumb use, in a row. I missed that shortcut, so this level doesn't quite look perfect, but it's a bit finicky. This whole room could use a little bit of tweaking. I'm sure they will before the final version of this game comes out, but for the time being, it's fine, it's fine. I pulled it off, I swear, just not on recording. As you can see, I've also sort of run past a couple clusters of red rings I would have preferred to collect, but that's only a waste of time if you bother to get them at all. So again, another reason why red rings worth points might be worth something. It's certainly worth going out of your way for extra jump pads and rainbow rings as you're going through these stages. Just thinking back to how little control I had over Shadow during this part of the level in SA2, it's definitely worth noting that this game is a lot more fun and free as you're playing it. I think, at least. It's definitely an option for going forward with Sonic controls that I would recommend other games and other fan games use.
Eggman's robots are already inside the tree.
That said, I wouldn't recommend that all of the level design is borrowed from this game entirely. I'll be honest though, this stage, as bad as it was my first playthrough, has slowly become one of my favorites to blast through, mainly because it's a surprisingly normal stage layout when you know the layout and where to go and what to do and where to get the most points. It's fairly straightforward, there's branching paths, but you just learn to ignore the ones that don't give you points. So here I am on the path that happens to give you more points. Now I'm not sure if you saw it there, but this happened both here and in Blue Jungle, that the stomp lets you boost afterwards. I'm not quite sure how this works, but if you hold forward and stomp, Sonic will get a burst of speed going off of that stomp. I'm not sure if that's... I mean, it must be intended, obviously, but it definitely feels like an extra nuance to the playstyle that I'm not entirely well versed in. Same goes for the light attack, which I have still yet to use, and I still don't know quite how it works. Texty, fill him in.
Ready? Go! Ready? Go! Ready? Go! Ready? 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 Go! Can't stop now! Lighting!
One thing to note while I'm here is the time bonus ticking down in this stage. If you are personally somebody who prefers the Generations Lost World means of testing a player, ranking a player, one thing I would recommend is paying attention to your score once you finish the stage. I mentioned before that the time bonus ticks down from 100,000 points after a certain time in the stage. I like to think of that sort of as the developer's S-rank time. A good, healthy number to think of as the speedrun time. While points are a lot more nebulous, so having a letter requirement for those makes a lot more sense. If you can get 100,000 points at the end of a stage, then you got your max developer expected time. Obviously, I didn't do that here, but that's mainly because I am getting distracted by enemies and rings and other such things.
Let's go. Tails, get over
Waterfall Chase is probably the most demanding stage in the game to get a good rank on. It sets a determined path, and you really need to hit every rainbow ring you can come across. I'm sure maybe rings might be worth a bit more, but there's also so few rings in this stage that you have to capitalize on every single one you can get your hands on. That shortcut to the left with the enter beam, don't take it unless you're going for the best time, because over on this pathway there's more points, and this is the only way I've found to get an S rank. Now this shortcut over here, not necessary. You can jump to this pathway from the leftmost pathway with a will time boost jump, but this is the pathway you have to go to get the most rings, and thus the most points once you get to the end of the stage. Also, it's important to avoid these rocks here, do your best to see where they're going and avoid them, based on, I guess, gravity or whatever it is pulling them away. And with enough points, you can scrape by with that S rank. One thing to note about Shadow's gameplay, as it differs from Sonic, is his use of the Chaos powers. They all have uses, but more interestingly, they all have drawbacks that I think are worth noting. You'll see me use Chaos Dash a lot. It is useful for extra platforming segments like this, because you can go upward with them, and that's its most useful feature. But you have to be holding the jump button while you use it to do that, thus making it just a little bit on the cumbersome, tricky side, because you have to account for when you jump, etc., in tune with the dash. It can be used here, though, to skip a huge chunk of the level, although that's obviously not the most point-rich way to go.
Is this machine really telling you where to go?
Chaos Spear, I don't really use that much. It's good for taking out long-range enemies. I imagine it's really good on these grind sections, just to take out the enemies on your way around without having to get off the rail. But since aiming it takes so long in the first-person mode, you won't see me solve many of the Chaos Spear puzzles as we go through. Chaos Control is useful in how it helps you time your attacks and hopefully time around enemy attacks and movements better, although it eats your double jump and makes the physics a bit wonky. Most interestingly, though, Chaos Blast. It's obviously an invincible screen clearing move at the expense of most of your meter, although I'm not sure if you noticed it there, but Chaos Blast gives you way less points per enemy. It gives you some, of course, so it's still not a terrible idea to use it in certain situations where you're afraid you might lose your rings from how many enemies are attacking you, but it's not always the right answer. And I think that's really interesting about the level design here. I stick with Dash most of the time because it's probably the most interesting to me, although take your preferences based on those shortcomings and what you're going for, obviously. Most of this room doesn't have anything going for it, so I like to skip the last couple segments since you're just missing out on a couple rings that I'm not going to need anyway, since the time bonus to me is just a little more useful here.
The simulation is over. Please proceed to the conference room.
One thing to bear in mind with these stages is sometimes enemy patterns can be randomized. These two egg pawns up here, I've seen in all sorts of places that make it a lot harder to do what is otherwise very straightforward pathfinding. Speedrunning is in a lot of ways about memorization and finding the optimal path, and if enemies are moving, then your optimal path keeps changing. I suppose that's another reason why high score is not the same thing as S rank, since S ranks usually are lenient enough to account for such randomization, although between that and the rocks and Waterfall Chase, I'm not entirely sure this game needed that randomization, although I'm hardly one to call this game unfun because of it.
Just like that.
In terms of memorization, this is another bit. I missed that red ring, which could have meant another couple points, except red rings don't give you points, which is, in my mind, a shortcoming here, and I'll promise I'll stop bringing that up now. Coming to these sections here, I might start skipping a lot of the expected route, just because this puzzle-solving stuff takes so long, especially if you whip out Chaos Spear. It's not worth it to me. I think that might be the intended way to play, although I am skipping a lot of points in favor of time trials, so
I need to solve it.
the user discretion is advised, I suppose. There really is no perfect route because of randomized enemies and how the puzzles can open up, so maybe finding your own route through can be part of the fun, especially based on those randomized enemies. Surprisingly, despite how much I skip here, this is still the longest stage in this S-rank run, and generally the longest stage in the game. Most of it is just centered around this one central puzzle, and then the rest of the level is surprisingly straightforward, although definitely doesn't feel that your first time through. While we're here though, I think it might be worth bringing up that I think it's a little weird that there's 2 jungle stages and 4 stages whose names begin with W in this game. I know it's just a me thing to even notice that in the first place, but it just feels a little less balanced than in a lot of other Sonic games. Worth praising, though, is the interactive music that kicks in here. I love the gear shift feeling that this offers, and I would say it's probably the most charming thing about these levels, namely Wild Ridge, escaping the Gnarl, Moldy Jungle, and the fight against the Vortex. We can only hope that there's going to be more going forward, as it's really fun to hear that shift in the musical tone as you're going through. Interactive scores are kind of a thing for me. I really love how they were used in Sonic Heroes, of all things, and if you've been a long-time viewer for me, you might know my love of Baldfalk's Be Cool, Be Wild, and Be Groovy, the remixed version of Rooftop Run's theme that is entirely interactive based on your placement in the stage. That kind of stuff just adds an extra bit of charm and gives you a real sense that the stage is lived in and has an emotional through line for the character as well. The Vortex is surprisingly demanding. I'm not sure why that is, but the S rank for this stage is easily the most difficult yet in the game, and I hope it doesn't get this difficult again going forward. Very precise. I find the easiest way to ensure that he doesn't do suboptimal attacks is by staying above the arena as much as possible. If you fall into the fog, try your best to homing attack under one of the vines hanging down, get right back up, and something about that will bait him into more favorable attack patterns going forward. You've got to collect a decent number of rings for a ring bonus when you get to the end of this stage, so that's why I'm using Chaos Control here to make up for the time lost collecting the rings here. I believe the intended route is to collect those rings in the middle of attack patterns, but I don't think that's worth doing. It really is more trouble than it's worth. The rings here are also important to pick up. I believe it's possible to not have to pick up the rings early on because the second arena has more rings to get. But that's way more trouble than it's worth while the boss is attacking you. So, take your pick, really.
This is taking long enough. It's time to end this.
The timing on the music here is really superb. I don't think it's precise in any way. The interactive music only starts once you hit him for the final time in the first arena, but it has a really nice flow where getting outside feels like you got outside. I think that's probably the most good feel a Sonic boss has felt in a long time. And that's kind of why this whole game has left me feeling relatively positive despite some shortcomings. It hits home in a lot of the right ways, and it's incredibly exhilarating when you play it optimally, ideally, or as close to it as I can get. I hope you've enjoyed this little run through. I don't know if there's any way to really close this out. Give the game a try if you haven't already, and I will catch you in whatever I get around to doing next. Thanks so much for watching.